Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to our citizen science presentation. We collaborate with the public library, we being the Santa Cruz Children's Museum of Discovery. We're in the Capitol Mall. And if you haven't visited, please come. We have about 4,000 visitors a month. We've been in existence for 3.5 years. And we're in the former Abercrombie and Fitch store. We do all kinds of programming for 0 to 7-year-olds and have 8,000 square feet of learning opportunities and fun, play-based learning for children. But one of our exciting projects that we've been doing for 4+ years is partnering with the library to do citizen science. And so today we have the pleasure of having Doriane Weiler, and a UCSC biologist, marine biologist, and she'll tell you more about herself. But I also want to remind you that next month, we usually have a presentation the first Thursday of every month, that's from 6:30 to 8. Due to the holiday next month, we will be doing a presentation on July 12th. Very well-known evolutionary biologist from UCSC named David Deemer will be talking about, are we really made of stardust? Yes. And that should be very exciting and interesting. I've heard him speak and he's wonderful. So just like I'm sure Dory will be tonight. Anyway, thank you for coming. Dory, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I've got a little slide after this. So today I'm going to be talking about local ecology and food web, specifically about my research that I do with mosquitofish, which you can see pictured here. But before I start talking about my research and the things that I do, I wanted to just give a brief introduction to myself about the research I've done in the past, which has been a little bit different and kind of all over the place, but still really interesting. So I started off doing behavioral research with octopuses and mantis shrimp. I looked at mantis shrimp mating behavior and monogamy. So it was really fun. It was a great way to just start off interacting with animals and get into a lab. I worked with little microscopic critters called stentor. They kind of like put cups and they filter feed. And then I went and studied abroad in French Polynesia and was there for a semester studying coral reef ecology. And also did a little bit of work in Cape Cod at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution on how larval squid are affected by ocean acidification. So I've done quite a bit of research. It's kind of all over the spectrum, so if you have any questions about that later, I can tell you a little bit more. But I wanted to start off just talking about what ecology is. You might have heard this word before, people throw it around a lot, but it's really important to just kind of get everybody on the same page. So ecology comes from the word oikos, which means house, and ology, which means study of. So ecology is just the study of the house of nature. So you can see here this beautiful kelp forest. You have all of these different living organisms. You have the kelp itself, you have the orange Garibaldi fish, and looks like some other kinds of algae. But we're also talking about the water and the water quality and the nutrients in the water and things like that. So when we talk about ecology, we're really looking at the entire ecosystem as a whole. But sometimes looking at entire ecosystems can be a little bit, I guess, overwhelming, and it makes sense to break down ecosystems into smaller bits. And so we talk about these different levels of studying ecology. And the smallest level that you can really do is individual ecology. So individual-based modeling or looking at animal behavior, that's kind of what falls into that category. The next level up is looking at populations, so groups of animals that live together and interact. But they're all the same species, so you can see this group of deer here. At the next level, you have a community, so that includes all the different animals in an area and living organisms. And finally, the biggest level that I really study is the ecosystem. So this is where ecology comes from. Ecosystem ecology seems a little bit redundant, but that looks at the entire ecosystem as a whole, both the living and non-living elements. Also, stop me at any time if you have questions. So, what I'm interested in is ecosystem ecology, so looking at the big picture. And you can see my little mosquitofish here in a little pond. You can see the algae and this really crystal clear blue water. So I'm really interested in getting to know what exactly is happening in all of these little ponds where these fish live. So the whole point of this talk and the main focus of my research is really looking at food webs and different organisms feeding on different things and how much they're eating and where they're eating it, and exactly what they're eating. So we have here a nice little, relatively simple food web looking at a freshwater ecosystem, and it has algae and water weeds, and these are the producers. So they're photosynthesizing and creating food for the rest of the animals at higher levels in the food web. And so after that, you have these, what we call primary consumers. And so these will eat the algae, and then other things eat them. So you can see the fly eats the water weed, but is then eaten by the dragonfly. But it's not exactly linear. Like, people talk a lot about these food chains, but food webs are basically more complicated food chains that give us a better idea of what's going on, because animals don't usually just eat one thing. And sometimes these food chains can get really complicated really fast. So this is actually a relatively simplified one compared to some of the things that I study. But this is a bogland food web, and you can see it includes things like plant nectar and also plant materials and plant litter. So this kind of starts integrating a little bit more of maybe the non-living things, looking at the connections within the ecosystem as a whole. So now that we know a little bit about food webs, I wanted to talk about what's happening here in Monterey Bay. So you can see a beautiful picture of our coastline. How many of you have seen an otter in the wild?
Ooh, many times.
Right? They're amazing. I came up here to Monterey Bay for the first time and saw one right away. I was just so enamored with them. But they are part of this really complex food web that's really important and kind of famous in Monterey Bay. And a lot of this research has actually been done by someone named Jim Estes, who is at UC Santa Cruz. So it's a really cool part of our local community that we have here. So you can see we have this sea otter up at the top, and they're known for eating sea urchins, but also a couple of other things. They eat abalone and crabs and things like that. You might have seen them eating on their backs, holding their little food. But you can see we do have this wonderful local food web that is so famous and thrives in the kelp forest. But these food webs aren't always staying like you see in these diagrams, right? Like, things in nature are always changing. They're not necessarily consistent. So you can see this otter is a little bit stressed out. What happens when you change the food web? All of these things are interconnected in nature. So what happens, or I guess the system with the sea otters is famous for something called a trophic cascade, which is kind of, they use the word cascade because it's kind of a waterfall of different consequences of direct and indirect behavioral interactions. So normally what you have is a sea otter who eats sea urchins who eats kelp, right? The three different things. And this is a simplified version of that complex food web we just saw. But when you take away the sea otters, like what happened when they were hunted, you end up having tons and tons of sea urchins and much less kelp. And you can see pictures of this actually happening, and this did happen in Monterey Bay. You're probably familiar with this. Luckily, they've recovered pretty well now. But this is that idea of a cascading effect, where something at the top controls something below it, and then that thing also controls something below it. So it's different levels that have both direct, where the sea otter is eating this, and then indirect, where the sea otter is affecting the algae. Direct and indirect impacts on the ecosystem. So when you add another level, this gets a little bit more complicated, right? So this was research that was done by Dr. Estes at UCSC, who I mentioned earlier, and he basically found that when you add whales into this system, the whales just recently, as early as 1991, started consuming sea otters. And so in some areas that weren't necessarily protected, so the otters can hide in bays and things like that, but out in the open ocean, the otters would be eaten by these whales, and then you'd have way more sea urchins and less kelp. So you have this sort of cascading effect. And you can see the relative effects with the different arrow sizes here. So this happens in a lot of different systems, and this is the system that I'm really interested in, is freshwater ecology. So this is another helpful diagram, because sometimes trophic cascades can be a little difficult to follow. So in this experiment, they actually used an entire lake in Michigan and manipulated variables. So they split the lake in half right at that line, And on one side, they removed all the bass. And bass are the main predators in this system. So you can see him over there, not very friendly looking. So when you have bass, that up arrow, then the fish that they eat decrease, and the things that those fish eat, which are called plankton, increase, and then the things that those eat decrease. So you have these like differences in the relative abundances of these organisms. And so these little guys are what make the water cloudy. So on this side where they remove the bass, you can see the indirect effect of including bass because the water isn't cloudy there. So it's pretty amazing how like impactful this is for the ecosystem. You can actually see this coloration difference that occurred in this lake. I think that's pretty wild and a pretty powerful example of ecology at work. So, how can we use this information? Like, why does this matter for us? Yes, my name is Doria. I have to include her somewhere in the presentation. So, you know, just gotta go for it sometimes. But I really like to kind of integrate some applied research into my basic research. So I'll pursue different lines of curiosity where we see what happens when something changes, but it would also be nice to be able to use that for management, right? So in comes the mosquito fish. So mosquito fish are a little bit infamous for ecologists. They're the most widespread freshwater fish in the world. They're found on every continent except for Antarctica because they would freeze, clearly. But they're also known as the plague minnow because people have introduced them everywhere, but their effects aren't always necessarily positive. So in some cases, they will compete with the native species and even outcompete them to the point where mosquito fish are more abundant than the native species that we would normally find in the ecosystem. So they're really highly invasive, but at the same time, like no villain in a story is ever black and white, right? So even though they're kind of the villain here, they also do a great service to us in eating mosquito larvae. So this is kind of what piqued my interest, is this sort of contrast between their kind of relatively negative influence on native ecosystems, but also their usefulness to us and how we balance those two things. So this is just a map of the United States showing where these fish are native to. So they originally started in just that yellow section of the United States, and now they're all across the United States. They've been deliberately introduced and actually continue to be introduced throughout, I know throughout California and probably elsewhere. So we have these places called mosquito vector control, and they're actually in California. This is, I think, Contra Costa mosquito vector control, but they release thousands of mosquito fish, hundreds of pounds of mosquito fish into agricultural fields, like rice fields, every year. So they grow them in these tubs, kind of like a nice little hatchery, and I just stuck a little camera in one of them, and you can see how dense these mosquito fish are. They have tons of these fish, probably literally tons.
And they introduce them into the field in what fashion?
I'm not actually sure the actual mechanism. I'm sure they transport them somehow and like literally just release them into the field, probably straight from either buckets or however they transport them. But I've never actually seen it done. That's a good point.
Like in water?
In water, yeah. Yeah, in water. They're live fish that they transfer. And the great thing for mosquito vector control is these fish are really hardy, so they can survive all these trips, and they reproduce relatively quickly, and they have a lot of offspring. So mosquito fish are cool because they give live birth, and that also means that when they give birth, their offspring are a lot larger, and so there's a higher probability of survival as opposed to an animal that gives birth through eggs. Because those offspring can kind of swim and hide, but eggs can't really swim and hide. They're just kind of vulnerable to predators. So this is a map of Santa Cruz County with Monterey Bay, and each little dot indicates one of our field sites where we've collected mosquito fish for our experiments. And these are just the places that we've gone. They're probably in a lot more places than this. But basically, if you've looked into any pond around here with slow-moving or not-moving water, you've probably seen a mosquito fish. They're surface feeders, so they come up to the top, just kind of boop their little mouths, and will grab things from the surface. and also in the water column, but that is one of the reasons why you can see them, because they're feeding up there. So does anybody recognize this pond? This is actually Antonelli Pond. It's down in Delaware, kind of near the UCSC coastal campus in the Seymour Center. And this is one of our sample sites. I was just out there with some of my team collecting fish, so pretty cool. And it's really convenient to have a system that you can find fish literally down the road. It's not even a minute drive from our main building. So let's bring these guys into our food web story a little bit. So if we think of these mosquito fish and go back to that picture that had the bass on it, where the bass are changing their relative abundances, you can see where you have a lot of mosquito fish, you'll have fewer of these little zooplankton and much more algae. And in areas where you have fewer mosquito fish, you'll have more algae and also bigger algae, so they're more efficient feeders, or bigger plankton, sorry. They're more efficient feeders and they'll eat more algae, so you have less of these little green photosynthesizers in the pond. So mosquito fish can have these really big ecosystem effects just because they eat so much, they eat continuously. You might say, but Dory, how do you know this happens? Like, do you just sit there and you just watch these fish eat and then you count plankton, and is that kind of what you do? And the answer is yes. So we actually have a whole array. We have 50 of these little mini ponds, and they're 300-gallon Rubbermaid tanks. And we put fish in them and manipulate different variables, so we'll put in extra nutrients. Or in this particular experiment, we're keeping male fish and female fish separated so they're not interacting. But we'll manipulate a lot of different things and see how those mosquito fish change the ecosystem. So there's a picture of me getting one of them ready, just to give you an idea of the scale of these things. They're pretty small, but also large enough to mimic a natural system. And in some cases, actually, the places where we collect mosquito fish from are relatively close to that size. They can be in really small ponds and be pretty happy. So yeah, that's just kind of the size that they look like.
Are these all just for this one particular fish?
Yes, they are. So we have 50 of them. I'm running an experiment right now, and we actually have 48 right now. Not that that's that critically important. But yeah, we have fish in all of them and are testing different things.
How do you mimic the natural environment for these little creatures?
That's a great question. So we actually go out and collect things from their natural environment. So in this picture, you can see me and one of my lab mates, and we're actually shoveling out pond sediment from Westlake Pond. I don't know if you've been up there, there's a little playground and things like that. But we shovel the sediment and collect it. We have like a massive bucket, and then we'll dump some of that sediment to inoculate these ponds with some of the natural critters that are in there. And we do that for plankton as well, the things that are swimming around in the water column. We'll go out with nets and throw in the nets and collect the little critters as we pull the nets in, dump them in a big bucket, and then take them and put a little bit of each of them into each pond. So.
And you know the difference between the sexes?
Yeah, we do. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but the main cue is their size once they're mature. So this is a picture of me taking one of the samples. So I showed you the algae in that little diagram. And so this is how we collect algae. This is just one of the things that we do. We put the water in the top, and then we use that little pump that I have to suck the water through and get the algae on a little filter that's there. So we do that 48 times for each of the mesocosms, so we can detect if the fish are having an effect on the algae indirectly. So through these experiments, we've shown that mosquito fish do have these predicted direct and indirect effects on ecosystems. So they do end up causing that trophic cascade that we saw. And not only that, but we've also shown through these experiments that they compete with native species like salmon. We actually did an experiment where we put juvenile salmon and mosquito fish together in some treatments, and sometimes the salmon were just on their own, and they didn't grow quite as well when they were competing with the mosquito fish. So if we're trying to manage salmon population, that might not be such a good thing. So going back to your question about the male versus female mosquito fish, we can tell them apart because of their sizes. And the fancy term for this is dimorphism. There are two different kind of shapes or figures that they have. So the females tend to be much larger, and they also have these rotund bellies because they give live births. They're holding all their babies in there. And then the nice gentleman fish are a lot smaller, and they also have an extended fin underneath, called a gonopodium, another fancy word. So they also behave differently. So I'll show you a cool little video of that later on as well. So the interesting thing about the differences between the sexes is they're having different ecosystem effects. And we did an experiment where we looked at different sex ratios in the mesocosms, in these little mini ponds, and found that populations that are female biased tend to have the stronger ecosystem effects. So these females are really aggressively feeding on the tiny critters in the water. And then the things that those tiny critters eat explode in abundance. The algae is really, really abundant. The water is a little bit cloudier, and the things that normally eat them decrease in abundance. So you are getting that direct effect of the prey decreasing and the indirect effect of the prey increasing. Does that make sense? I wish I could draw it out for you, because it's it can be tricky to follow. So if you have any questions, please do interrupt me.
I'm sorry, so
Yes.
more women means?
So more women means less plankton,
Less plankton.
more algae.
More algae.
Because
Yep,
they're
got it.
eating more than the males.
Okay.
And this could just be a body size effect, right? It could be that they're eating more just because they're bigger. So that's something that I'm interested in is this really a body size effect, or could there be something else going on?
But aren't the females eating for 200 babies?
Yeah, exactly, right? They are eating for 200 babies, and they're bigger. So it makes sense that they would eat more, right? But at the same time, there could be other things that change what they eat, how they eat, and how much they eat. And one of those things that I'm interested in is the interaction between male and female mosquitofish. So the male mosquitofish will actually chase female mosquitofish around, and these female mosquitofish can be approached by thousands of males in a day. And when that's happening to them, they're not feeding as much. Studies have shown that in the presence of males, when they're faced with this behavior, females have a decreased feeding efficiency. And so we know that this is happening. And I'll show you a little video of their mating behavior really quickly, just because I think it's cool. So that's the male behind. There are two males. And he moves his foot up and he pokes it. Oh, but it's delayed. This is the slow motion version, so you can see it. Because it happens in like half a second. It's really fast. So he moves his fin there, and then you can't even see her reaction. But I think that's pretty cool, and I spend a lot of time watching these fish interact. So fun stuff. So this relates directly to my current research, which is running one of these big pond experiments and looking at how this harassment behavior impacts food webs. So in some of these ponds, we have male fish and female fish separated, and in some of them, we have them mixed together. So in the separate ones, they aren't interacting, and in the ones where they're mixed together, they are interacting. So if this behavior actually does impact food webs, we'll be able to detect it in this experiment, especially because we have so many ponds, which gives us a lot of statistical power to see something like that that might be a little bit more subtle. So that's actually running right now. I was up at 4:30 this morning starting this experiment, so it's been a really cool experience and also really rigorous, but it's such an interesting question, I just can't let it go.
So the harassment behavior is them interacting with each other?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's when
Not
the male
them
fish
interacting
chases
with the
down the
ecosystem.
female one. Yes,
And
yeah,
the
yeah.
purpose of it's mating, right?
Yes.
Like the male fish are always there
Yes.
trying to
Yeah.
inseminate the female fish.
Exactly.
That's the basis of their contact.
Exactly.
Okay.
They're just chasing them around, purely motivated by interacting with the female mosquitofish. And they're pretty relentless too, so this does have a big effect on the female behavior.
So could one female have sex with multiple males, like multiple
Yes.
times a day? Multiple times? Like,
Yes,
how
we
often?
don't track them.
Okay.
I don't track them in this system, but people have. But like I said, they can be approached by thousands of 1,000 times in a day. And it can be from different males, it can be from the same ones. And we can talk about that afterward if we have more questions.
It makes sense that they'd have trouble eating.
Yeah, they're getting a lot of attention. So the other thing that I'm interested in is when they're being chased around, that might affect what they're eating, right? So they have to be really vigilant and keep track of these males around them. And if they're doing that, they might not be able to pay as good of attention to the things that they're chomping on in the water. So I kind of have this suspicion that maybe if you change the sex ratio or if you change something about this interaction, it might make females either eat more mosquito larvae or fewer mosquito larvae, which would be good for us, right? Because if they're eating more mosquito larvae, then that has less of an effect on the natural systems, right? And they're doing more of what we want them to do. So this is a really cool way that we can use both behavioral ecology and ecosystem ecology to manage natural environments. Yeah?
What do the mosquito larvae eat?
Oh, that is a great question. I honestly don't know. I have no idea what the mosquito larvae eat. Yeah, but that's a good question, right? Because we're looking at the different trophic cascade effects. So I should look into that. I don't know what they eat. Good question. Okay, so another aspect of the research that I'm doing is looking at how different populations vary in their behavior. So here you can see I'm standing next to 4 different tanks, and we'll put male and female fish together and record videos of them and look at how they interact and look for differences between this and the populations. You can see me scooping one up there from one of these ponds that we have and getting ready to pop them in one of those tanks. So the pond models that I have where they're physically separated is like the extreme side of the spectrum of interaction, right, where there's no interaction. But we might be able to get a more nuanced sort of understanding if we use fish that have more variation in their reproductive behaviors than just interacting, not interacting. So that's kind of part of the basis for this. So this is what I was telling you about earlier when we went on this trip to go and look for mosquito fish. This is in Bishop, California, so over the Sierras, and it's about an 8-hour drive from here through the mountains, but it is beautiful when you go out there. And the reason why we go to these ponds is because there's a ton of temperature variation out there. So some of these ponds are fed by geothermal springs that are really warm, and some of them are close to normal temperatures. But you can see these ponds are crystal clear. That's a mosquito fish right there on the surface of the water, so you're getting that reflection. It's only one fish. But these ponds are really, really, really beautiful and also really shallow, so it makes for a great study environment. I can actually go out there and just bend over and stick my face in the water for the entirety of the pond and watch mosquito fish interact. So it's a really great system to sort of start to look at how temperature might affect this harassment behavior. Another possibility for why harassment might be different in these populations is the presence or absence of predators. So if you remember back to the bass diagram, so the bass are like big, voracious predatory fish that will go after mosquito fish, right? So when you have that bass coming after you, it behooves you to not draw a lot of attention to yourself and be conspicuous, which this chasing behavior really does. And so in these populations that have predators, it might make sense for evolution to favor fish that aren't quite so conspicuous in their behavior and maybe have lower harassment levels. So this is something that we're still testing and still looking at, but it's pretty exciting, I think. All right, so I'll end with this. This is just like the ultimate overall goal of my research. I'm hoping to find a way to manipulate harassment behavior of the male fish to alter female feeding behavior and lower their environmental impact. So these fish are in a lot of places, and if we can use creative ways that aren't like chemicals or something else that would have a negative impact on the environment, if we can just do something else that kind of has more of an indirect effect on these fish, then we might be able to even better manage mosquito larvae, if that makes sense.
So the question, the ultimate goal of all of this research
Yes.
is to eliminate mosquitoes' impact on the human.
Yeah, so that's the ultimate applied goal here, is to use something about this harassment behavior and how it might affect diet specificity to increase the female mosquito fish consumption of mosquito larvae, and therefore decrease mosquitoes in the population.
Okay, so fewer,
Mm-hmm.
the more they're eating, the fewer mosquitoes will be attacking us.
Exactly. Yeah,
Go.
exactly. But we want to make sure that they're eating the mosquito larvae more than other things in the system that other fish might be more interested in. Because it could be that the native fish don't want to eat mosquito larvae, right? And so if the mosquito fish are competing with these native fish to eat other things in the water, it could not be so great for those native fish because they're competing with each other. So if we can push the mosquito fish in the direction of things that the native fish aren't eating, then that would be good for both the native
How
system
would you
and
do
for
that?
us. So that's what I was saying about the harassment behavior is maybe if there are more males in the population or there's a different ratio, when we introduce them, so when we go out and put these fish in the fields, we might be able to change female diet specificity. And this is like the dream scenario here too. I can't say that this is actually happening because the research is still in process or in progress. So it's really kind of the cutting edge hypothesis, if you will, for just an idea for.
Well, you have to start somewhere, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
And so hypothetically, there might be like a alternate ratio of
Yeah,
males
like
and females that would have them
Yes.
consuming the most amount of mosquito fish
Right.
while simultaneously having them not feed on something like salmon.
perfect.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Or something that salmon eat because they're not going to directly eat the salmon. But yes.
How would you keep those sex ratios the same over multiple generations if you wanted
That's a good point because they do have 1-to-1 male to female ratios when they give birth. So it would mostly be, it would have a stronger impact when we're introducing them than later on. But in these rice fields, it's seasonal. So we introduce them and then we flood them out of the system so they're gone. And so they're reintroducing them every single year. And so even though when they give birth, the sex ratio might go back to 1-to-1, that introductory ratio could potentially be beneficial. Again, this is like just a hypothesis at this point, to be clear.
When you say they give birth, I thought that most fish laid eggs.
They do, actually. I didn't know that these fish gave live birth until I started grad school, actually. I was starting off working with the different species of fish, and then I found these and was just so fascinated by them. But they do, they have live baby fish, and they basically look like miniature versions of the adult fish.
And what, hundreds at a time, dozens?
It's really variable, so it can be anywhere from 2 to a couple hundred, yeah.
that? Is one female.
Hugely variable. And people aren't really sure what causes that variation. I mean, a lot of it could be because of like body condition or food availability, but we really don't know. I don't know if that's what's important.
Why some lay eggs and why others give birth?
No, so we know that. What I was saying is we don't actually know why the variation in the number of offspring is so great.
Between 2 and hundreds.
Yeah. But one of the reasons that people think this live birth in fish evolved is because it's really beneficial to have offspring that are larger, right? So when you're giving birth to a live fish that can swim and control where it is, it can go and hide, as opposed to something like an egg where when you release your eggs, those are immediately, they're immediately vulnerable. And so there's a lot of...
Most of them get eaten by other critters.
Exactly, yeah. So there's a lot of, I mean, we can't say for sure we weren't around when this evolved, but that's kind of one of the hypotheses for why life history might favor live birth over
Then why
having
don't
eggs.
they all give live birth?
Oh, that's a great question. There are also benefits to laying eggs. So you can have more offspring, right? There's a probability that if a lot of those survive, then you will have more offspring in the future than those organisms that give live birth.
So it's kind of like an experiment.
Yeah, it's an evolutionary experiment that happens over history in thousands of generations.
Right.
So.
How many other fish give live birth? Like, how common is that?
So this is an entire fish family. So these guys are really closely related to things like guppies. So guppies also give live birth. I want to say there are maybe 40 freshwater fish. There are also marine fish that do this. So this evolved in a totally separate, unrelated species of fish or family of fish. So it's pretty interesting. Yeah, and it's really amazing. I mean, the fact that both of those can exist really is kind of a testament to how complex and interesting evolution can be, right? There are a lot of different ways to solve a problem of reproducing.
In my hometown in upstate New York, there's a lake that my family visits every year, has milfoil infusion.
Oh.
Eurasian milfoil, it's an algae.
Okay.
And so they get big, they hire divers and they go down with big nets and try to take it up and all.
Yeah.
But obviously there must be something related to fish there too.
Yeah, so if the algae lives, so with these fish, the things that they feed on, so that indirect interaction, the kind of green algae-like things are more in the water column than like growing on a surface. And so they've actually done kind of mitigation efforts for overgrowth of algae using fish introductions, which is really, really cool. So it kind of changes the relative abundances if you add or subtract predators from the environment. So I don't know about that particular system, but I do know that that's been done in some systems where they have algae overgrowth, which can be caused by things like phosphorus or nutrient input.
The salt
from-
on
Exactly.
the snowy
Exactly.
roads.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, a lot of things that can cause it. All right, well with that, thank you so much for your time. I guess I already took your questions. But yeah, and also a big thank you to UC Santa Cruz for giving me a place to do this wonderful research and the facilities and support, and also NSF, who just recently gave me a grant to pursue this. So thanks, NSF.
Hey.
Yeah, so I have 3 years of funding too.
It's a really big deal.
Sister is very excited about this, but it is very exciting. I just found out in March, so
3 more years to
3 more
continue
years
your
of
research
full
here.
support, yeah. So,
And then what happens?
and then I'm a grown up and I have to figure out what I want to do. So it would be my dream to be a professor. I think it's a really good balance of the sort of mentorship that I really enjoy, and also teaching, but also being able to do my research. But I could also see myself going into something like management. So I'm taking this research and making it a little bit more applied. So we'll see. Ask me in like 4 years when I'm done with my PhD. The world could be a very different place.
So are there big economic impacts of mosquitoes out there? I mean, I know there are health-wise, but
Of mosquitoes or mosquito fish?
of mosquitoes,
Oh.
which, right, I would presume this isn't, you said it's related to mosquitoes.
So I don't know the actual numbers on that, but I would assume that there's a huge economic impact. We do a lot of different things aside from introducing mosquito fish to different populations. Like I know we do like spraying to reduce the actual like flying organisms, because these are their larvae that are in the water. But that's the only thing that I can really think of right now that they do. But I'm sure that is really expensive. So.
Is there any
Right.
research through like World Health Organization?
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Like, are they funding, some of the mosquito-borne
I'm
human diseases?
I'm sure they are. Yeah, mosquitoes actually are the #1 killer of humans internationally. So, very dangerous animal. Yeah.
Do you know anything about mosquito abatement equipment? Because we're going there with a bunch of people in upstate New York, and there are a lot of mosquitoes. So
Yeah.
we've been researching the bands that you put on your wrist,
Yeah.
and someone said peppermint oil, and
Yeah.
any tips
So
would be welcome.
I mean that stuff is really terrible. But when I went to Maria, I was like eaten by mosquito I was gonna say eaten by mosquito fish. I was not eaten by mosquito fish, but I was eaten by mosquitoes that were flying around, and I guess people tried those wristbands and they worked relatively well, but what's interesting is what draws mosquitoes to you is actually your CO2 from your respiration. And so they know right where you are, right? Because you're like breathing out this CO2, and that's a signal to them to come get you. So I think that might be where the different oils come from, like maybe that covers up the CO2. I don't know. I'm just guessing here.
People
But
at one point talked about Skin So Soft, an
Yeah.
Avon product that would.
interesting.
So if you have a higher body temperature, do you give off more CO2?
Yeah. So if you have a higher body temperature or a faster metabolism.
Yeah,
that would
like
give off
my husband next to me, and
Yeah. Yeah.
They go right down.
Yeah, exactly. So just hang around your husband and that's your mosquito.
Always go around with someone who's warm. The warmer than you
Yeah,
are. Like
exactly.
the bear story, you only have to go
Exactly.
faster than the.
Or have someone just like go for a jog so they're like, you know, giving off more CO2.
Well, don't, things like perfume and cologne, doesn't that make a difference whether you're bothered or not also?
I'm not really sure. The only signal that I know that they use is the CO2, and even when you spray things on, it might attract them because you smell different, I guess. But really what attracts them is just the CO2 that comes off of you. So the smell doesn't necessarily conceal the chemistry that you're giving off.
I think it has to eventually get down to feet.
I know, even though it's
Flowing
terrible.
wispy clothing. covers up your
Really
skin.
what it comes down to is just having fewer mosquitoes in the air, so mosquito fish in an effective way. Anyways, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
everyone.
You're gonna talk about your little friends over here.
Oh yeah, I do have some mosquito fish over here in a little tank if you want to check them out.
Hold for a moment, I'll try and bring this over.
So, I do.
Yeah, you can really see the difference in size.
Yeah. Some of these, so see there,
It would be pretty
that guy's
interesting what
a-
that spot was about.
Yeah, I actually I have some theories about this spot. That the males actually use it as like a cue for them to
Like a
target the
bullseye.
females. Yeah, exactly. And so it might be that in populations that have high harassment, because we see variation in the intensity of that spot, and in some populations they don't have it. So I was almost thinking that in populations that have high harassment behavior, they may have evolved reduced spots so that the males don't have that signal and can't get to them as easily. But it could also be, I mean, that spot makes them more obvious to predators, so it could be predators. So it's kind of hard to
Right.
piece apart.